Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details. Hi there, it's Andy from the Adelaide Podcast Festival, and what a huge night it was for 2019 at the Elephant British Pub during this year's Adelaide Fringe. We had a wide range of podcast genres recording live right there on the stage, including that Wall Street guy, and we even added stand-up comedy to the lineup this year. And a huge thank you to our sponsors, Omni Studio, Zoom, Ozcast Network, Fresh 92.7, the Elephant British Pub, Young Henry's, Rumpus Room, Studio Creations, Notice More, Cartel Media. For all content from the night, subscribe to Ozcast Network Extra on your favourite podcasting app. For merchandise and updates, hit up adelaidepodcastfestival.com.au. And we look forward to seeing you next time at the Adelaide Podcast Festival.
So please do welcome to the stage right now, that Wall Street guy!
The information contained within this podcast does not consider your personal circumstances and is of a general nature only. You should not act on it without first obtaining professional financial advice specific to your circumstances.
Paul Atherton is an ex-Wall Street advisor on a mission to help young people win back their financial power, wealth and security. He does this by helping them understand the hidden world of finance, risk and investments, helps them figure out how it impacts them, and to seize the opportunities to make it work to their advantage. This is Paul Street Journal.
A very funny title for a series where we talk a little bit about personal finance. Of all things, I suppose. So as a young person, I suppose many of you would imagine that's not something I'm particularly interested in, but I'm much the wealthier, I would say, after listening to Paul. So I would very much encourage that we all give this man the attention that he deserves as a very experienced person. And on that note, welcome, Paul.
Thanks, Tim, and hello to everyone.
Yes, and thank you to the Adelaide Podcast Festival for having us. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, Paul, can you, just for starters, give us a little bit of a background to yourself? What have you been up to?
Okay, so a little bit of my background. So I was born and raised in Adelaide. Went to school. Yeah, good. Went to school in Adelaide. Went to university in Adelaide. Did my engineering degree in Australia, in Adelaide. Did a brief stint in the steel industry, and realized I didn't want to be in the steel industry for the rest of my life. So I applied for a scholarship. I applied for studying in the United States. Got a scholarship in Boston. Traveled over there and did my graduate work in Boston, and studied. Actually, it was in the early 90s. So when you studied in Adelaide, for those in my generation, in university, you either had a choice when you first started. You either be an engineer or an accountant or a doctor. You had to have those narrow choices. I'm sure it's different today, Tim, but that was the way it was then. But in the States, you could choose anything really, and you had much broader perspective. So I really geeked out, and I did mathematics, statistics, engineering as well, but also a lot of computer science. And while I was studying, I met my lovely wife, who's from New York, and upon graduation, finishing my degree, I thought I was going to travel to Europe and be an engineer, but she said, look, I don't care what you're going to do, you're just doing it in New York. So we traveled to New York. Well, she traveled back. I went to New York, and I walked down. I remember going down Fifth Avenue, handing out my CV to various investment banks, and coming home and, just waiting to see what the response was. And the next day I got invited back by all of them.
Wow.
So I went in and interviewed at all these investment banks, and, I was a young boy, and of course all my study was in math and engineering. I had no finance degree, no finance knowledge, and I walked in, and I remember in one particular interview, the big American guy got up and he started shouting at me. He says, Paul, right, okay, there's a bond that's got 6% coupon, it's paying biannually, it's maturing in a year and a half, the yield curve's at 5%, what's the price of the bond? And I said, I really don't understand a word that just came out of your mouth. And he laughed very loudly, and then asked me other questions. But I got home, and my wife asked me, how did you do? And I said, I don't think I did terribly well, really. But the next day I got offered by all of the banks, and I took the job where the guy knew I didn't know anything. So, and the rest, as they say, is history. So 25 years plus on Wall Street, and now back in Adelaide to talk to you, Tim.
So I think it's safe to say 25 years on Wall Street that you know finance. You know money.
Yeah.
Vast amounts, I'm sure.
Yeah. I like to think of not just money, but in terms of course, I understand money and where it's invested and how to make more money. But one of my areas of expertise is trying to avoid significant losses, and that was really one of the things I was employed to do, was to help navigate banks and navigate institutions and large institutions, and in some cases countries, to avoid sort of catastrophic results.
Right. Well, you know about significant losses, and I, as a young person, face these kinds of challenges on a day-to-day basis with Kmart putting out their catalogs at a unfaithful basis, right? So are there any tips that you can give, say, me and perhaps the rest of the people in this room, varying in age, experience, and I'm sure wealth? What are the 3 things that we should probably be keeping in mind in terms of the way that we manage and think about money? Very broad question.
I think one of the first things I like to tell people, particularly one of the reasons I got into advisory back home, is because I really wanted to interface with what I call the retail market, or individuals and people. And because I found it rather upsetting that some young people are paying no attention whatsoever for investing in stocks and the market. Now, if you went to New York, the opposite is the case. The average young person is very invested. And so here I thought, well, gee, this is a travesty. You know, you're 25, or younger, or maybe in your 20s, and you've got this opportunity to start putting money in the market. And if you do that for a good solid 20 years, you are going to be well off. I mean, you will definitely have a significant investment portfolio.
So start young.
And so the first lesson is, there's not a single person that's ever said, I invested too early. Like, no one ever says that. No one ever goes, the problem I faced, Tim, is I invested when I was too young. That does not happen. So you just literally cannot start young enough. And I when I'm talking to young people, I say, right, when you leave this room, I want you to go out and invest money. I want you to take money out of the bank, open an account, and start investing. And they think I'm joking, but I'm serious. You really, really should. So everybody in this room, when you leave the room, take your money out of your wallet and start investing. You literally cannot start early enough. So get in.
Right.
That's number one.
Yeah, absolutely. And so number two, it maybe based less in investing and maybe on keeping money in your pocket, as far, maybe, am I assuming too much? Well,
I think the other thing is, that I linked a little bit to investing is keeping consistency. So, it's like keeping fit. If you go to the gym and you do a heroic effort one time and then forget to go back for the next year, we know that's not going to be terribly helpful. But with investing, you probably could do that and get away with it. But I think it's not going to be anywhere near as effective, quite clearly. So a great idea is to start just regular dripping into an investment account and doing that on a regular basis. It can be very small. I mean, if you didn't buy that latte or cut back on something, and I usually, I don't like saying people to cut back, but just maybe if you get a pay rise or some types of money, regularly just put it in and think about it as a tax that you place on yourself and regularly invest. And if you run the numbers, which I have done, the difference between investing even small amounts is, it can be measured in the multi-hundreds of thousands over 20 years. And that's real money and has a significant impact on your life. So that's number two. It's not necessarily in that order, but yeah.
And so you were saying you don't like telling people to cut back, but would you say that keeping a regular check on your expenditure is something you should keep an eye on? Like, I often hear you talk about whenever you check, you always find something that you didn't know was there.
Yeah, it's good to do an inventory check, and I don't try and belabor this too much because we always look at, most advisors, when they look at what you're trying to save a bit more, can again cut back on the latte, but you can usually find something that you're spending and some expenditure that you don't really care much about. So cut that out. But the other side of the equation, of course, is to earn more. So you could get much more leverage out of earning more, which I think is actually another investment, which we don't often think about. But investing in yourself is quite clearly, to me, the biggest and most beneficial investment that you can possibly make. I mean, one of the investments that I make, for example, is I regularly go to a institution called Toastmasters. It's public speaking, communication, and I think 2 years there is worth an entire college degree to me, and it's effectively free. I mean, it's about $270 a year. So a plug for Toastmasters. But the point is that investing in yourself pays just massive dividends, whether it's in education, and it doesn't have to be a formal, it can be informal. Again, Toastmasters, just a community organization. But anything that improves your communication skills, your negotiating skills, anything that enables you to be slightly ahead of the curve on where the economy's going. I mean, if you learn how to code, you're never going to be without a job. I mean, that's the sort of the modern joke, isn't it? Learn to code. That's what I tell my boys. So, there is invest in yourself for sure.
Right, so I mean that's the personal finance side of what we do, and we have a reasonably large library that you guys can all check out on our podcast, That Wall Street Guy. There's a second element to our podcast, which I like to call currency affairs, as an allusion to perhaps global economics, let's say. Yeah. And we've talked a little bit earlier. I was talking to David and Dr. John Bruni on the Strategicon podcast about China. And that is often something we talk about in financial terms. So we talk about how they own a lot of debt. And I know that you know a lot about this subject. And I know that you've run the numbers on it. And I want, perhaps you could explain to people what the model of China is. How are they so successful where they are? Or not successful?
Not successful, yeah. It's a very... I mean, the Chinese model is the Japanese model, which is before that a Brazilian model, which before that was a Russian model, which is... but the modern day version is Japan and now China, which is... they call it... There's various names for it. The Asian development model is probably the most modern name for it, but essentially it is the significant reallocation of resources from the household sector to the production sector. And it moves massive amounts of money transferred to either manufacturing, which makes manufacturing very successful. But when that sort of runs out of puff, it really puts a significant amount of money into the investment. So investment is where the GDP is generated. That does not mean wealth. So I'll just make that clear that GDP is almost always considered in the media and by economists to be synonymous with wealth. And generally it should be, and certainly I think in the West on a very proxy basis it is. There are a lot of weaknesses with GDP. I'm not a big fan of it, but for China it very much is not a proxy for wealth. I mean, their GDP has got no correlation to wealth generation.
Right, could you explain to me, because it's something that I found that you've mentioned that has changed my opinion of China quite a lot, is we often, I think, we see lots of cheap things that are made in China, right?
That's right.
With the assumption is that it's cheap labor, that everything's made in China because it's just people get paid a pittance to do whatever.
Well, there's 1.3 billion people, and we assume therefore that production is cheap, and therefore we're buying cheap products. But it's actually not that at all. It's cheap capital, and it shouldn't be cheap capital at all. I mean, it should be cheap labor, and there's no way that. So effectively, the United States is exporting capital to China. The other way around. China's exporting capital at pace to the United States. It's ridiculous. It should be the other way around. So it's capital intensive. So just looking at some of the ratios. So most industrialized Western countries have a consumer base, or their GDP or their global their country's economy consists of mostly consumption, or the household sector. The household sector is probably 70+% of the economy, higher or lower depending on which country.
People just going out and buying stuff.
Just our stuff we do, whether it's a house and building a house and buying stuff. It's what we
Electricity,
do. And then actually that's not unfair. So why wouldn't it be that way? It's exactly what it should be. It should be a reflection of what you and I do as reflecting in the economy. But in China, it is depending on the numbers you read, it's in the low 40s. And at one stage it got into the mid 30s or maybe the high 30s, which actually the numbers are just so surreal. Like it beggars to belief that it can actually get to that low in terms of consumption. And what that effectively means is, I call it stealing money. So it's the state steals money straight from the household sector and puts it into the production center.
So the idea is that people put money in the bank because they're not spending it, and then the state
there
borrows
are multiple ways to, so I call steal it, but take it. But one of them is repression of interest rates. But there are other ways, the repression of currency, and the other one is repression of, a classic is the repression of how much take-home money the workers get. So the workers don't get much of a share of the GDP as they should. And actually the biggest offender in that, by the way, is Germany. Germany is the biggest offender in terms of take-home money. That's why Germany is probably the biggest offender in terms of surplus countries.
So that doesn't sound particularly healthy in terms of an investment point of view. Like, I'm not rushing to go out and invest in Chinese investments, right? So just as a last point, where do you think we should look? What's the up-and-coming power? What developing country, for instance, should I be looking at?
Yeah, so just briefly back to China. So one of the obsessions, again, with economists have with GDP is that there's a belief that there's no such thing as a bad investment. And you can just throw money at build a bridge and it's a positive investment. This is clearly not true, but implicitly in most economists' models, they're talking about it, is implicitly true. But it isn't. I mean, if I said I'm going to spend $10 billion and just dig a hole, we would know it's not true. But somehow if I build a bridge, even if it goes nowhere, it's a great investment. And if it's not a good investment, it means it's wealth destroying. So early days in China, you could throw money anywhere and it would have a positive impact on the economy. So that's why China was an economic miracle. It no longer is. But there is another country that is massively in that frame, and that's India. I lived in India for 4 years, and I can assure you, if you throw money anywhere in any direction in that place, and any spending on any infrastructure, it's going to be positive. And
why would that be, for instance?
It is. Well, so China, where 30 years ago when it had really a lot of the economic miracle was what I call an economic catch-up because of a significantly repressive communist state. And if you can read about how repressive it was really catching up. It had 20, 30 years or more, 40 years maybe, of zero investment or negative investment. And India has the same thing, but it's through a lack of investment by corruption. And without belaboring the point, but the new government and Modi's government and the changes that have under place means that the dollars are now getting into the right place. And you can see it. I mean, the 10 fastest growing in the cities in the world. So where do you think they are?
You would assume that they would be Western. Sounds like, it would be
depending,
New York
depending on who you talk to, but
sure.
Most people would say at least half would be China and maybe
wow.
Singapore would be there or something. That's what most people would say. But actually, every single one of them is India.
Wow. All 10?
Top 10.
Wow.
So, and not by a small amount. So it's the fastest growing larger country in the world. And it hasn't even got started. So, it should take people's attention. Certainly got mine.
Throw money at it. That's the idea. Well, that's just a little preview, I suppose, of the things that we get to talk about. We end up in many interesting discussions about things around the world, and of course about our own personal wallets, and all of that plays into each other. So, thank you very much again for Adelaide Podcast Festival for having us.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Dan.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.